A corpse in the herbaceous border. A Miss Marple mystery. Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in the quiet gardens of St. Mary Mead, where the herbaceous border blooms in perfect order. Roses, lavender, foxgloves, and something far less welcome hidden beneath the petals. At first, it seemed like an ordinary morning in the garden, until the gardener's spade struck something it was never meant to find: a body. The villagers are horrified, yet quick to insist the crime must have come from outside the village. But Miss Marple knows better. She notices the disturbed soil, the broken stem of a prized flower, and the curious fact that someone had been tending that very patch of earth only the night before. Flowers grow quietly. Secrets do too. And as Miss Marple begins to dig beneath the surface, she realizes the corpse was not hidden there by chance, but planted with purpose. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the most beautiful gardens can bury the darkest truths. Before we uncover who planted death among the flowers, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Body in the Herbaceous Border. Morning in St. Mary Mead had a way of pretending nothing bad could ever happen there. The sky was pale and washed clean after a night of rain, and the village looked almost too tidy, as if somebody had polished it before sunrise. Gardens breathed with fresh, damp earth, hedges stood clipped and proper, and the lanes smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke. It was the sort of morning that made old ladies open windows and talk across fences, the sort of morning where gossip traveled faster than the milk cart. At the vicarage, Mrs. Dalrymple was already in the garden before breakfast, fussing over the flower beds for the church garden party that was to be held that afternoon. It was the biggest little event of the season, and she treated it like royalty was coming. The herbaceous border along the south path was her pride. Tall delphiniums stood like soldiers, roses bent low under drops of rain, and thick clumps of lavender filled the air with that dry, sharp scent that lingered in the throat. She moved between them with her basket and scissors, clipping dead leaves, muttering to herself about slugs and weather and careless gardeners. It was all perfectly ordinary, until she saw the shoe. At first, it didn't make sense. A black leather shoe, polished so brightly it caught the morning light, sticking out from beneath the foxgloves. Mrs. Dalrymple stopped dead. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her mind refusing to fit it into the picture. Shoes didn't grow in flower beds. Not polished ones. Then she took one careful step closer and saw the leg attached to it. The scream that followed ripped through the garden so sharply that birds burst from the trees in a flutter of black wings. The gardener, Mr. Pike, came running from the greenhouse, nearly dropping his trowel. He reached her and froze at once. Half hidden beneath crushed flowers and damp soil lay a man, face turned into the earth, arms twisted awkwardly beneath him. His dark coat was smeared with mud, and one hand, pale and stiff, lay open against the stone border like it had reached for help and found none. Dead. No doubt about it. By 9:30, the police had arrived, along with half the village, pretending they were simply passing by. Inspector Slack stood over the body with that hard little look of his, hands in his coat pockets, eyes moving over every inch of the garden. He didn't like surprises, and this one had landed right in the middle of his breakfast. "No signs of robbery," he muttered. "No wallet, no papers, Nothing in the pockets but loose tobacco, a folded handkerchief, and one strange little thing. A fresh sprig of rosemary. Inspector Slack frowned at it. What sort of fellow carries herbs in his pocket? Nobody answered. Mrs. Dalrymple sat in the house trembling over untouched tea, repeating that she'd never seen the man in her life. Her daughter Helen stood by the fireplace, pale as milk, saying even less. She looked frightened, but then anybody would after finding a corpse among the flowers, wouldn't they? Across the village, Miss Marple heard the news before noon, delivered with great excitement by her maid, who always managed to know things before they were properly known. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. Her face showed very little, but her eyes sharpened at once. "A man in the vicarage garden?" she said quietly. "Yes, miss, right in the flower border. They say his neck's bent something dreadful." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her hands never stopping. Villages, she often thought, were rather like ponds, calm on the surface, but stir the water, and all sorts of ugly things rose up from the bottom. By the afternoon, Inspector Slack had turned the dead man over and found bruising at the back of the skull. Not an accident, then. Somebody had struck him. Hard. And there was something else. Caught in the dead man's coat pocket, snagged in the lining, was a brass button. Not from his own coat, different color, different cut. A button from someone else. That changed things, because now there had been contact, a struggle maybe, a killer close enough to lose part of himself. And as the body was carried away through the garden gate, Miss Marple stood watching from across the lane, her knitting needles folded in her hands, her sharp old eyes fixed on the torn earth where the man had lain. The rosemary bothered her, not because it was strange, because it meant something. Rosemary was for remembrance, and if a dead man carried remembrance into a quiet village like St. Mary Mead, then he'd come there for a reason. A reason, Miss Marple thought, that somebody had been desperate to bury. And now the ground had given him back. Chapter 2. Roots Beneath the Soil. By the following morning, the dead man in the flower bed had a name, and somehow that made the whole business heavier. Arthur Bell, a traveling plant seller known in nearby market towns for rare seeds, cuttings, and a quick tongue that could charm housewives into buying things they didn't need. Inspector Slack had traced him easily enough through labels in his satchel, though the satchel itself had been found tucked behind the hedge at the vicarage, hidden carefully out of sight. That bothered Slack at once. A killer who hides a bag but leaves the body in plain view isn't thinking straight, or worse, is thinking too clearly. Miss Marple heard the name over breakfast and sat very still with her tea halfway to her lips. Arthur Bell. She didn't know him, but names carried weight. They made strangers into people, and people always came with history. History was where trouble lived. A body in a flower bed was shocking enough, but a man with purpose in the village was another matter. Men like Arthur Bell didn't wander into St. Mary Mead by chance. Villages like this weren't places one simply passed through. One came for a reason. The village was alive with talk before noon. Outside the butcher's, women stood too long over simple purchases. At the post office, letters were forgotten in hands while whispers carried over shoulders. Every face had that same look, excitement covered thinly with concern. Miss Marple had long noticed that murder sharpened village life like frost sharpened air. It woke people up, made them watch. So she listened. And listening, Miss Marple knew, was where the truth often slipped out by mistake. That afternoon, she paid a quiet call at the vicarage under the sensible excuse of checking on Mrs. Dalrymple. The poor woman looked worn through already, pale and fluttering about the drawing-room like a trapped bird. She spoke of nothing but her ruined flowers, her dreadful shock, the horror of finding such a thing so near her roses. Miss Marple listened kindly, but her eyes wandered. Helen Dalrymple sat by the window, quiet, far too quiet. Her fingers twisted tightly together in her lap, and she kept glancing at the garden path as though expecting someone to appear there. Fear, Miss Marple thought. Not grief, not shock, fear. And fear always belonged somewhere. Outside, Inspector Slack was still studying the flower bed, now trampled by boots and marked by police ropes. In proper daylight, the signs of struggle were clearer. Broken stems bent flat into the mud, a dragged heel mark near the stone edge, soil kicked loose. Arthur Bell hadn't simply collapsed there. He'd fought hard. Then came the brass button. Inspector Slack had spent half the morning walking door to door, comparing coats and jackets, until it led him to Colonel Harper, a proud old widower with a military back and a temper to match. Harper disliked questions and disliked Slack even more. But there it was, his coat missing one brass button, same make, same shape, same worn edge. The colonel gave a short laugh. Buttons fall off, happens all the time. And that was true. But they didn't usually fall into a dead man's pocket. Miss Marple heard of that and felt her suspicions deepen. Colonel Harper was a stiff man, careful with himself. Careful men rarely lost things by accident. Later that evening, another discovery turned the whole thing darker. Arthur Bell's room at the village inn was searched, and beneath the mattress they found money. £20, far more than a man like Bell ought to have carried. Not earnings, not honest ones. And in the fireplace, half burned, was a torn letter. Most of it was ash, but one line remained. "If you come back to the garden, I'll pay, but this must end." That line spread into Miss Marple's mind like ink in water. The garden, not the house, not the village, the garden itself. That meant the vicarage grounds held history. Something ugly had happened there before Arthur Bell turned up dead among the flowers. Something he knew. And if Arthur Bell knew it, then he used it for money, blackmail. It had that smell all over it now. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting, resting still in her lap, which was unusual enough by itself. Her mind moved through the facts slowly. A dead man carrying rosemary, a hidden satchel, a missing button, a frightened girl, a proud colonel, and a letter speaking of a garden as though it were a grave, because perhaps it was. Miss Marple looked into the fire and felt that familiar chill settle over her. Arthur Bell's murder wasn't the beginning. It was the sound of an old secret breaking open, and whatever had been buried in that garden once before wasn't finished yet. Chapter 3. The Last Thing Under the Roses. The rain began just after dusk, soft at first, then steady against the windows of the vicarage, like fingers tapping to be let in. By then, Inspector Slack had reached the same miserable point every investigator reaches: too many loose ends, and none of them tying together cleanly. Colonel Harper had motive enough if blackmail was involved. Helen Dalrymple had fear written all over her face. Mrs. Dalrymple was hiding something, though whether it was guilt or shame was harder to tell. And Arthur Bell, dead in the flower bed, had clearly come back for something more than money. Miss Marple asked Inspector Slack for one small thing: to gather everyone together. Slack didn't like it. He never liked Miss Marple's methods, though they had an annoying habit of working. Still, by 8 o'clock, they were all in the drawing-room of the vicarage. Mrs. Dalrymple sat stiff in her chair, clutching her handkerchief so tightly it looked ready to tear. Helen stood near the fireplace, pale and rigid. Colonel Harper leaned against the mantel, jaw tight, eyes cold. And near the door stood Mr. Pike, the gardener, cap in hand, looking smaller than usual somehow. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, knitting untouched in her lap. For a moment nobody spoke, only the rain. Then Miss Marple lifted her eyes and began. She said Arthur Bell had not come to St. Mary Mead by chance. He had come because of something that happened years ago in that very garden, something buried, not in soil, but in silence. Years earlier, during one of the vicarage summer parties, there had been an argument in the Herbaceous Border. Helen Dalrymple, young then, frightened and angry, had pushed a man during a quarrel. He fell backwards against the stone edging and struck his head, dead before anyone could help. It had been an accident, but accidents can ruin lives just the same. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a sharp cry at that, and Helen buried her hands in her face. Colonel Harper's face went gray, because it was Harper who had helped cover it up. He'd been a family friend, respected, practical. He'd arranged everything, quietly, no police, no scandal. The dead man had been a drifter, alone in the world, and the whole ugly thing had vanished into the dark. Except it hadn't. Arthur Bell had seen it, not clearly, perhaps, but enough to understand, and enough to wait. Miss Marple explained it simply. Arthur Bell had kept that secret for years, using it when he needed money. A letter here, a visit there, quiet demands, quiet payments, always tied to the garden, always tied to fear. Colonel Harper spoke then, sharp as broken glass. "I never killed him." And Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said, "you didn't." That was when all eyes turned, not to Helen, not to Mrs. Dalrymple, to Mr. Pike, the gardener. Miss Marple's voice softened, but it cut deeper for it. Mr. Pike knew the truth, too. He'd been working late that night years ago and seen enough to understand what happened. He'd watched Arthur Bell return again and again, squeezing money from the family. And this time Pike had heard the argument in the garden. Arthur Bell wanted more money, more threats, and Pike saw what would happen. The family ruined, Helen exposed, everything dragged into daylight. So Pike acted, one blow with the garden spade to the back of Arthur Bell's head, quick, hard, final. Then he dragged the body into the flower bed, thinking it would all settle there like everything else, like roots over soil. Mr. Pike's face broke apart then. The fight went out of him all at once. His hands shook, and his voice came rough and cracked as he confessed it. He said he'd done it to protect Helen, to protect the family, to stop the past from poisoning them any longer. But murder has its own poison. Inspector Slack stepped forward and placed a hand on Pike's shoulder. No drama, no shouting, just the dull weight of handcuffs and the end of hiding. When they were gone, the room felt colder. Helen wept quietly. Mrs. Dalrymple stared at the fire as though she could burn the past away if she looked hard enough. Colonel Harper stood like stone, older than he had an hour before. Miss Marple rose and walked to the rain-streaked window, looking out at the dark garden where the flowers bent under the weather. Funny thing about gardens, she thought. People spend years tending them, trimming them, keeping them neat for the world to see. But underneath, roots twist where nobody looks, and sometimes, buried among them, the dead don't stay quiet. If you enjoyed this mystery, subscribe and stay with us for the next case, because in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stay buried for long, and somewhere, even now, another one may be waiting to rise.